Welcome. This is Evolution Lecture 1 for Ms. McCullough's Marine Science class. Due to technical issues that I explained before, I'm redoing this lecture. Thus, there's no one in the room with me right now, so it's a little weird, but we're going to go ahead and try this, see what happens. It's like I have an audience that's going to automatically laugh at all my jokes, or at least laugh at something. All right, couple things. Yes, I know. This thing right here is in the way. I'm sorry. Eventually I'll get it taken care of, but for now, hopefully we'll be able to see it through it. Secondly, yes, I know. There's a big glare right around here. Just pretend like it's the sun. You'll be fine. Okay? So, this lecture is going to be going on evolution. And this is part 1. Okay? So the first thing that we have to understand when we talk about evolution is that it all goes back to one guy. Everything that we're going to be talking about here goes back to one guy. And that guy is Charles Darwin. Okay? So it all goes back to Charles Darwin. Okay? And this is unique. There's not many cases in science where we can say most of our current understanding goes back to just one person. Okay? But it's true in evolution. Right? And so it's a little bit unique, but it's important that we know then a little bit about Darwin's life. Okay? So the first thing you need to know that it was the year 1831. You guys probably covered this back in sophomore biology, but we're going to review it a little bit now anyway because it's so important. Because it all goes back to Charles. All right? 1831, Darwin sailed on a ship called the Beagle. The Beagle. Sailed on HMS Beagle. Okay? And he was a naturalist. And basically, he, in a nutshell, sailed around the world to all these really cool places all across the globe, collecting specimens. He would, ironically, shoot a lot of them, collect them, kill them, preserve them in some way, bring them back on the ship, and store them. And this is what he did for years, and he eventually collected this massive collection of really diverse organisms from around the world and brought them all back to England. All right? The main place, the cool place, the place that we always remember and associate with Darwin, even though he collected specimens from different places, the main place that he collected from was the Galapagos Island. Right? And to this day, they're still kind of always associated with Darwin. Okay? So, Darwin set sail, and he's this naturalist. He was horribly seasick most of the time he was out there, so he wasn't having a lot of fun. But he collected all these specimens, and then eventually he returns home to England. And he's got just bags and chests and crates full of dead animals, basically. Really diverse dead animals, but dead animals nonetheless. And like any avid scientist, does he get back and immediately begin working on his seminal work and publishing it as quickly as possible? No. Darwin got back to England and he sat around and basically thought about his idea for like 20 years. Okay? So it didn't come together right away. He was a young man when he went on the Beagle. He waited 20 years before he actually published anything. Right? And in that 20 years, Darwin basically kind of sat around and looked at all of his dead animals, looked at this great diversity that he saw in all these specimens that he collected, all right? And he noticed that many of these specimens were really unique, all right? Or they had unique features, but then were also very similar to other specimens. And you could look at, say, the finches that he collected, which are kind of his most famous example. And you could look at them and see all these differences, okay? And he thought that was interesting, but it didn't really trigger anything. Except that at some point, a guy named Thomas Malthus came along. And he was a cool guy, and he published something, his seminal paper, that had to do with competition. And this is the idea that he gave to Darwin that was a massive trigger for Darwin. Okay? Basically, Malthus was saying in this paper that all living things compete. They're competing for space, they're competing for mates, they're competing for food, all right? which makes sense. It's true. We're all competing all the time, okay? And Darwin took that and he said, maybe that could explain some of the differences. Maybe competition has something to do with why I'm looking at all these different organisms that are so similar in many ways, but always have these really unique, singular or multisingular differences, right? And that was really important. That was a huge piece of information for Darwin. The other important thing to remember was that Darwin is already familiar with something called artificial selection. All right, he was already familiar with artificial selection. Okay? Artificial selection is when organisms are bred for certain traits. Okay? And Darwin was familiar with this because of pigeons. He was an avid pigeon collector, and he knew that he could breed specific pigeons for desired traits. If he had a pigeon with big, strong arms, let's say, he knew that he could breed this pigeon with other pigeons and get offspring that had big, strong, did I say arms? I meant to say wings. Big, strong wings. Okay? This makes sense to us now, but at the time, this was kind of like, why does it do that? Why do they do that? All right? And this idea of artificial selection, combined with Malthus's ideas of competition, led Darwin to his big idea. This idea, the idea that you know that you can breed specific organisms for specific traits, led to Darwin's theory of natural selection. Another great example, of course, artificial selection. What do we do all the time whenever we're getting dogs, right? If you have a dog that's a golden retriever, what does that mean? Well, that means that a particular line of dogs has been bred for years and years and years to get a dog that's, this size, has a long golden coat, has this type of friendly disposition, will chase whatever, all right? That's a golden retriever. What makes that a golden retriever? Humans. Humans have made that a golden retriever. Otherwise, it's just Canis familiaris, right? Common dog. That's why I can still mate with, say, a husky or a German shepherd, all right? That's all artificial selection. Organisms are bred for specific traits. Natural selection, okay? Natural selection is different. This is what Darwin came up with after sitting on all those specimens for 20 years, reading Malthus's works, okay, and learning about competition, getting that idea, and knowing what he knows about artificial selection, how certain organisms can be bred for certain traits. Darwin comes up with his theory of natural selection, which states that organisms with favorable traits are more likely to survive, reproduce, and pass on those traits. Okay? So natural selection, Darwin's theory of natural selection, says that organisms with favorable traits are more likely to survive, reproduce, and pass on those traits. Okay? And again, I think that this just kind of makes sense now. Okay? We know that if an organism has some trait or characteristic that allows it to survive better, it allows it to either find food better, it allows it to hide or not get eaten by predators better, it allows it to find a mate better, okay? Then it's more likely to survive. And then, if it's going to survive, then it's probably going to reproduce. And if it reproduces, we now know that it can pass on those traits, right? And that's key. That wasn't known at the time, okay? Darwin, for example, and a classic example, you know how beagles, dogs again, beagles have those big kind of long ears that they kind of drag on the ground, some species do? Darwin, for example, thought that those ears were that way because humans had petted them so much. Like over the years, you pat a dog, and its ears kind of stretch out. And that's why dogs had, or some dogs, had such long, droopy ears. We know that's not true. If that were true, then I could cut my arm off, and then my child would be likely to have no arm. Okay? And that's not how it works. Okay? It actually works through our DNA and through mutations. Okay? These variations, these favorable traits, okay, are caused by mutations. And we know that now. Darwin didn't know that. Okay? So let's write that down. Page. Okay? Variations in populations. So now we're talking about those traits, these favorable traits, which are variations. Variations come from mutations. Okay? But Darwin didn't know this. We know this now. This is one of the key pieces that was added after the fact. Everything else, Darwin pretty much got. All right? But variations from mutation, he didn't know. All right? Okay, questions. Oh, wait. You can't ask any questions because you're just watching this on a computer. All right? On your paper now, it says, poor Russell Wallace. Okay? You really should feel bad for Russell Wallace. Poor Russell Wallace came up with basically the same idea as Darwin's theory of natural selection. But have you ever heard of Russell Wallace? No. Okay? Darwin beat him to publication. In fact, Russell Wallace and Darwin were in communication. And Darwin, I think, heard that maybe Russell Wallace was like going to publish this same idea. And Darwin had already been sitting around for like 20 years, all right, looking at his dead animals. He was like, there's no way Russell Wallace is going to beat me. So he did publish first. He got all the recognition, right? And poor Russell Wallace was left to fade into obscurity, even though he came up with basically the exact same idea. But no one knows that. So poor Russell Wallace. All right? All right, so what do we know? We know there's a guy named Darwin. We know that he collected lots of specimens. We know that he collected these specimens, came back to England, sat around for a while, bred pigeons through artificial selection, came up with this idea from Malthus about competition, put those ideas together, came up with his theory of natural selection, right? The idea that organisms with favorable traits are more likely to survive, reproduce, and pass on those traits. Okay? That's what we know so far. What that really means from Darwin and from our point of view in marine science, and what we're going to be talking about when we talk about all the diversity in the oceans, okay, is that what Darwin's theory helps explain is where adaptations come from. And that's a word we're going to use a lot. That's really the key word that I want you to get out of this. Okay? Darwin's theory explains how adaptations develop. Okay? So what is an adaptation? Right? An adaptation is a word you've probably heard it before. All right? You've probably go through here for a second. Okay. Maybe you've been told that you can or can't adapt to a given situation, right? But for our purposes, an adaptation, right? An adaptation is something that helps an organism survive in their environment, okay? Something that helps an organism survive in their environment. And this last part is really important, okay? It's not enough to say that you have something that helps you survive if it doesn't help you survive in the environment that you're in, okay? Great. You've got this awesome heavy fur coat that helps you survive in the Arctic, but you live in the desert, okay? That's not an adaptation, because in fact that's going to hurt you, okay? That's just an unfortunate mutation that sucks for you, okay? An adaptation is something that helps an organism survive in their environment. So if you live in the Arctic, where it's really, really cold, and you have this heavy fur coat that helps you survive, that's an adaptation, because you're in the environment where you live, and this structural change, this variation from mutation, is helping you to adapt to your environment. So that's an adaptation. And we're going to talk about those a lot when we talk about marine science, because we're going to talk about how in the oceans, we've got all these different areas that are inhabited by crazy different organisms that have all adapted to survive in that specific environment. Whether that environment is miles down at the bottom of the ocean, or whether that environment is on the rocky coast right here in Maine. Okay? But they all have adaptations. We're going to go through quite a few examples of those. All right? There are two types of adaptations. Okay? The first is the one that I just referred to, which is a structural adaptation. Okay? Structural adaptation. A structural adaptation is an actual change in the physical body. Okay? Change in physical body. Excuse me, I should say positive change, but you know what I mean, all right? That's like the heavy coat, all right? Penguins. Penguins have numerous structural adaptations. They've got modified wings that they can't fly, but helps them swim in the water, right? They've got webbed feet, right, which make them kind of awkward on land to kind of waddle around, but makes them be super fast swimmers in the ocean. Those are structural adaptations. Feet, wings, okay? The heavy down underneath their feathers. They've got modified feathers, right? Those are adaptations, structural adaptations, okay? And these are the ones, these structural adaptations, are the ones that we're going to talk about the most because they're the most obvious, okay? If we're talking about why sharks have such sharp teeth, well, they have such sharp teeth because they eat meat. And that's a structural adaptation that they have. If sharks had dull, flat teeth like a horse, and they were still expected to, say, eat seals, they'd just spend their whole day chewing, okay? And that's not going to help them survive better, okay? Now, a horse, if a horse had really sharp teeth, all right, like a shark, but they're expected to eat grass all day, right? That's really bad structural adaptation. That's not an adaptation, okay? So structural adaptation is a change in the physical body that benefits. Put that in parentheses. Okay, some of the benefits then. Classic example of this, okay? Classic example of this is the peppered moth example, okay? Now, I'm a pretty awesome artist, so bear with me here, okay? Peppered moth example happened during the Industrial Revolution. Okay? And this is like the classic go-to natural selection, structural adaptation example, right? It's in all the books, it's everywhere. And it basically said this, all right? During the Industrial Revolution, you of course have factories. That's a factory. Okay? And factories, what do? They produce lots of smoke. Okay? What happens when a lot of smoke gets in the air? Well, all the trees, right? And watch, I'm going to change colors here. There's a tree. Okay? What happens? All this smoke goes onto the bark and makes those trees that maybe were once really light, really dark. Okay? With me so far? You got it. Smoke, smog, making trees, all their bark really dark black. Okay? Now, in England, I think this is in England, wherever this is, there's a particular type of moth called the peppered moth. The peppered moth, we'll say it looks like that. That's a moth. Moth. Okay? The peppered moth can occur in two color variations, white or black. Okay? Now, which of these two do you think is going to be camouflaged better on this nice sooty tree? Okay? Duh, the black one. Okay? Because if we draw the black one on here, look, you can't even see that. But if you draw the white one, okay, it's going to look like that. And that shows up better than that. Okay, so what's going to happen? All the birds are going to come along, and they're going to eat this one. right? And so in fact, what happened was this color morph, this color variation right here, right, existed at about, I don't remember the exact numbers, but let's say around 90%, right? Around 90% of all peppered moths at this time were black, right? And that makes sense. That makes sense according to Darwin's theory of natural selection. These have a favorable trait. They have a favorable structural adaptation, okay? Well, what happens? Okay? Eventually, the Industrial Revolution goes by the wayside, okay? All these factories that used to make all this smoke, what happens? They go away. So what happens to the trees? Well, the trees continue to grow. But now, their trunks aren't sooty anymore, okay? Now they're this nice gray, light color like they're supposed to be, right? So what do you think happens to the peppered moth population, okay? Now suddenly, which ones show up, okay? These nice black ones that camouflage themselves so well before now stick out like a sore thumb. I don't know where that saying comes from. It doesn't make sense. How does a sore thumb stick out? My thumb hurts. Does it stick out anymore right now? Anyway. What about this white one then? Okay, obviously it still sticks out because I'm drawing in black. But this one is now much more camouflaged than this one. Now this one has the favorable adaptation, the favorable trait, the structural adaptation that helps it survive, reproduce, and pass on that trait. And in fact, guess what happens? Now suddenly my pen breaks. That's what happens. Hold on. Okay? Now suddenly, I've decided to just draw the moths as squares. Okay? So before, the dark moth existed at 90%. It was like this. Well, guess what happened? Over a few years, now suddenly this one's at 90%. Why? Because now this color morph, this white color morph is favored, and the black color morph isn't anymore. Okay? And this is natural selection. This is Darwin's theory happening in the real world. And they've replicated this, right? They have taken this exact scenario in a lab and done it. And it happens. It works this way. Okay? And this ability to camouflage themselves, that's a structural adaptation. Structural adaptation. Okay? And we can think of lots of other examples of structural adaptations. Any type of camouflage, any type of mimicry, all right, in nature, those are structural adaptations. Plus, of course, any type of body part that is favorable. Okay? Whether that's hair, whether that's ears, whether that's a heightened sense of smell, whether that's faster legs, whether that's a bigger body size, a smaller body size, whatever it is, all of those are structural adaptations, okay? And best exemplified through this peppered moth example, all right? There is another type of adaptation. There's something called a physiological adaptation. For our purposes in marine science, we're not going to talk about this that much, okay? Really the best case example of this, all right? Well, first of all, let me tell you what it is. Instead of a change in the structure of an organism, this is a change in an organism's metabolic processes, all right? I'll explain that. Changes in organisms' metabolic processes. Okay? And what this means is like, instead of an actual structure changing, the ability of the body to perform the way it does changes. Okay? The classic example of this is bacteria and antibiotics. You've probably heard in the news all this fear stuff about the superbug that we're creating by using hand sanitizer or antibiotic hand sanitizer. Okay? Because what they've shown is that antibiotics, right, they kill off bacteria, but they can actually cause very, very quick examples of natural selection. Because you've got billions of bacteria, you're throwing all these drugs at them, and very quickly, in terms of evolutionary timescales, some of them become resistant to the antibiotics. They have something that makes them not die from the antibiotics. That something is a physiological adaptation. Right? This poison basically isn't killing them. Not because they have some structure that allows them to survive. They don't have some magical shield that comes out and prevents the poison from killing them. If they did, that would be a structural adaptation. Instead, there's something that goes on in their metabolism, in their cellular workings, that prevents them from being killed by the antibiotics. Right? And that would be a physiological adaptation. This obviously happens in marine environments, okay? But for our purposes, when we're talking about marine mammals, fish, all that stuff, we're not going to worry about physiological adaptations that much because there's just not that many good examples of them, okay, in the oceans. So don't worry about this one too much. I want you to know that it's out there. There's two types of adaptations, physiological and structural, but we're going to be pretty much only dealing with the structural adaptations, okay? Either type of adaptation, whether it's structural or physiological or structural, either type are direct evidences of evolution. Adaptations equal direct evidence of evolution. Okay? Why are they direct? Because we can see them happening. Okay? We can go to a population in a lab and we can artificially select, or in some cases naturally select, for different scenarios where we will see adaptations develop through generations, okay? And we can see them happen. We can see organisms develop better traits. Over our lifetimes, there are populations in the world. Rare, usually this takes hundreds, thousands, even millions of years. But there are cases where we can see this in our lifetime, adaptations develop in populations and lead to a higher chance of success in those individuals. And therefore those individuals more likely survive, reproduce, and pass on. Those are direct evidences then. There are other evidences of evolution which are indirect, okay? Ones that we can't see happening, but that we know are actually evidences of evolution, showing that this has occurred in the past. This includes things like fossils, okay, biochemistry, biochemical markers. Right, those are all indirect. Anatomy, we can make anatomical comparisons. Right, the birds, bones of a bird's wing and the bones of a bat's wing, right, very similar. So that shows they share a common evolutionary ancestor. Things like that. But those are all indirect. Okay? Like the physiological adaptations, we're not going to really worry about these that much in marine science, in this marine science class. We're going to be focusing on these. Okay? Adaptations. How is it that these marine organisms are more likely to survive? What are their adaptations? How do these adaptations come about? What factors in their environment led to this species having this adaptation? That's what we're going to be talking about. But to understand that, you need to understand this kind of a whole background, right? Which again, I know you went over in software biology, but I want to review it briefly here. Okay? That's it. Thank you. Enjoy evolution lecture part 2 will be coming